The roar was what got Karen's attention first, a guttural bellow that vibrated through the soles of her sensible walking shoes. It wasn't the polite hum of a well-maintained lawnmower, nor the cheerful whine of a leaf blower operated by one of the compliant homeowners in the meticulously planned community of Willow Creek Estates. No, this was a primal scream of internal combustion, growing louder, closer, and undeniably aggressive. Karen Peabody, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, adjusted the perfectly aligned sunglasses perched on her perfectly sculpted nose and peered down Magnolia Drive. What she saw made the organic green smoothie she'd just consumed churn in her stomach with the force of a washing machine. Two massive bulldozers, looking like metallic beasts escaped from some prehistoric earth-moving expedition, were lumbering down the pristine asphalt. Behind them, a flatbed truck groaned under the weight of concrete barriers, the size of small refrigerators. And at the helm of the leading bulldozer, a figure stood silhouetted against the bright morning sun, a Stetson hat casting a defiant shadow. This wasn't on the agenda. Not the HOA agenda, not the city council agenda, not any reasonable person's agenda. Karen grabbed her phone, her fingers usually so adept at crafting passive-aggressive emails to residents, whose azaleas dared to bloom a shade off her. Fumbling with the touchscreen security, she barked into the receiver when the call finally connected. We have heavy machinery breaching the perimeter. 2 bulldozers and concrete, it's chaos. The bored voice, on the other end, drawled, "Ma'am, are you referring to the Henderson property again?" "Again," Karen sputtered. "This isn't about some overgrown weeds. This is industrial invasion. Mr. Henderson filed the proper permits for land grading and boundary reinforcement weeks ago, ma'am. All in accordance with county regulations." Karen's jaw dropped. Henderson, that insufferable newcomer on the outskirts, the one with the livestock and the audacity to not immediately replace his perfectly functional mailbox with the approved Victorian model. He was behind this. But the aesthetic, Karen wailed, gesturing dramatically at the approaching behemoths. The property values. This isn't some rural backwater. This is Willow Creek Estates. Ma'am, we've reviewed his plans. Everything is within his property lines and adheres to county ordinances. The security officer sounded like he was stifling a yawn. Unless they're actively encroaching on HOA common areas, there's nothing we can do. Karen hung up, her face a mask of disbelief and mounting fury. This couldn't be happening. Not on her watch. Not in her meticulously planned paradise. She watched, aghast, as the bulldozers rumbled onto the expansive property line separating Henderson's unruly acreage from the manicured perfection of Lot 14B, owned by the notoriously litigious Mrs. Higgins. Karen knew would be calling any minute now. Her voice, a shrill symphony of outrage and demands for immediate remediation. The bulldozer operator in the Stetson gave a jaunty wave in Karen's direction, a gesture she interpreted as pure, unadulterated mockery. This Henderson, whoever he thought he was declaring war on Willow Creek Estates. And by extension, on her. This wasn't just about property lines or landscaping. This was about control. This was about the very soul of Willow Creek Estates, a community built on order, conformity, and the strict enforcement of meticulously crafted bylaws. And Karen Peabody was its unwavering guardian. She marched back to her impeccably organized home office, her mind already racing, plotting her counterattack. Henderson might have bulldozers and concrete, but Karen Peabody had something far more powerful, the unwavering belief in the righteousness of her cause, and a meticulously indexed binder, containing every single violation in Willow Creek Estates. History. First, she'd delve into the archives, find any loophole, any forgotten bylaw that could be used to thwart Henderson's barbarity. Then, she'd rally the troops, the Architectural Review Committee, the Landscaping Standards Subcommittee, even Agnes from Neighborhood Watch, whose network of informants was surprisingly effective. Henderson had made a grave error. He had underestimated Karen Peabody. He had underestimated the power of the HOA, and he was about to learn a very expensive, very public lesson. The battle for Willow Creek Estates had begun, and Karen intended to win, even if it meant sacrificing her perfectly manicured nails in the process. 2 hours later, Karen sat amidst a swirling vortex of paperwork, her initial fury having transmuted into a cold, calculating resolve. Bylaw 3.12, subsection B, paragraph 7, excessive earth moving and soil displacement. While seemingly innocuous, Karen felt a flicker of hope. Henderson's bulldozing surely constituted excessive earth moving. It was a long shot, as the bylaw was primarily intended to prevent residents from creating unsightly mounds in their backyards. But Karen was desperate. She drafted a formal cease and desist letter, her fingers flying across the keyboard, each word dripping with righteous indignation. She cited Bylaw 3.12, subsection B, paragraph 7, highlighting the potential negative impact on neighboring properties and the overall aesthetic harmony of the community. She CC'd every member of the HOA board, the community manager, and, for good measure, the mayor's office. As she printed the letter, her phone buzzed. It was Mrs. Higgins, and her voice was even more shrill than Karen had anticipated. Karen, I just saw it. Those monstrosities are practically on my property line. My prize-winning petunias are trembling. What are you going to do, Karen? Ever the composed leader soothed her ruffled constituent. Agnes, rest assured, we are taking immediate action. I have already drafted a cease and desist letter, citing specific violations of our community bylaws. Mrs. Higgins scoffed. Karen, these are bulldozers. We need something stronger. We need the authorities. I have contacted security. Agnes, can they assure me that Henderson's activities are currently within his property lines and adhere to county regulations? County regulations? Mrs. Higgins shrieked. What about our regulations? What about the sanctity of Willow Creek Estates? Karen sighed inwardly. Dealing with panicked residents was almost as tiresome as dealing with rogue bulldozers. Agnes, trust me, we will resolve this. I have a plan. Her plan, however, was hinging entirely on the interpretation of a vaguely worded bylaw. She needed more leverage. That's when she remembered the architectural plans Henderson had submitted weeks ago, plans that had sailed through approval with barely a glance, as they seemed to indicate a rather standard, albeit larger, single-family home. Karen dug through her digital files, her frustration mounting as she couldn't locate the specific document. Where was that darn email? Finally, buried in a thread about revised pool fencing guidelines, she found it. Henderson's architectural renderings. She opened the file, and her eyes widened. This wasn't a standard single-family home. This was a compound. Multiple buildings, sprawling across the property, surrounded by what appeared to be high walls. And the boundary reinforcement mentioned in the security officer's dismissive tone now took on a far more ominous meaning. Karen zoomed in on the site plan. There, in stark black and white, were the outlines of what looked suspiciously like guard towers. And what were those markings near the main building? Were those stables? This wasn't just an aesthetic violation. This was a fundamental breach of the community's very nature. Willow Creek Estates wasn't zoned for livestock, let alone fortified compounds. Karen felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the ammunition she needed. Henderson wasn't just an eyesore. He was a threat to the established order. She immediately fired off another email to the HOA board, attaching the architectural plans and highlighting the discrepancies between the initial impression and the reality unfolding on Henderson's property. I believe, she wrote, her tone carefully calibrated to inspire outrage, that Mr. Henderson has deliberately misled the association regarding the nature of his construction. This is a clear violation of our community covenants and potentially constitutes fraud. The responses flooded in almost immediately. Shock, disbelief, outrage. Karen had successfully ignited the collective fury of Willow Creek Estates. Mrs. Higgins even replied with a string of fire emojis. Bolstered by the support of her community, Karen felt a renewed sense of purpose. The cease and desist letter was just the opening salvo. Now, it was time to escalate. She picked up the phone and dialed the number for the county planning department. This wasn't just an HOA matter anymore. This was about zoning regulations, building permits, and the very fabric of their suburban existence. Henderson was about to learn that you don't just waltz into Willow Creek Estates and build a fortress without facing the consequences. Karen Peabody would see to that. Part 3. The conversation with the county planning department was enlightening. Apparently, Mr. Henderson, in his infinite audacity, had submitted plans, and those plans had been approved. Everything, according to the bureaucratic drone on the other end of the line, was perfectly within regulations. The sprawling compound, the potential stables, all somehow compliant with local ordinances. Karen hung up, deflated but not defeated. There had to be a catch. No reasonable municipality would allow such a blatant disregard for suburban sensibilities. Unless Henderson had connections, unless he had somehow. The emergency meeting of the Willow Creek Estates HOA board was held in the clubhouse's Magnolia Room, a space usually reserved for book club gatherings and deceptively competitive bridge tournaments. Today, however, the air wasn't filled with the gentle aroma of chamomile tea and shortbread, but with the acrid scent of panic and impotent rage. Harold, the vice president, was stress-eating, a complimentary Danish, crumbs dusting the lapel of his perfectly pressed blazer. Eleanor from the landscaping committee clutched a sheaf of Henderson's architectural plans as if they were evidence in a capital trial, her face a mask of horticultural horror. Stables, she repeated for the 10th time, her voice rising in pitch. Can you imagine the smell? The effect on the soil? pH. My prize-winning azaleas are on the verge of a collective nervous breakdown. Bob, the fastidious chairman of the Architectural Review Committee, a man who once issued a formal violation for a welcome mat that was half an inch too wide, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. It's the precedent, Eleanor. Today it's stables. Tomorrow it's, I shudder to think, a private airstrip, a water park. The structural integrity of our community's aesthetic is at stake. Karen let the crescendo of indignation build, a conductor warming up her orchestra of outrage. She stood at the head of the long mahogany table, a portrait of serene command amidst the chaos. When the babble reached its peak, she cleared her throat, a small sharp sound that sliced through the noise like a scalpel. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil swirling around her. "We have all been made aware of this situation with Mr. Henderson. We've had a direct confrontation. We now know the unfortunate legal reality." She paused, letting the weight of their defeat sink in. "His property is not, due to a lamentable bureaucratic oversight predating our tenure, subject to the covenants and restrictions of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." A collective groan filled the room. Harold looked as if he might actually cry into his pastry. "However," Karen continued, her voice hardening, "steel replacing the velvet, that does not mean we are powerless. It simply means we must be more creative." She leaned forward, her eyes sweeping across the faces of her board members, each one now hanging on her every word. "Mr. Henderson may have outmaneuvered us on the legal front of HOA bylaws, but he has made one critical error. He has chosen to build his monstrosity in our neighborhood. He is surrounded, and we will employ a strategy of total, relentless, and perfectly legal attrition." She began to pace, her sensible heels clicking a rhythmic, determined beat on the polished floor. "I propose a three-pronged attack. Phase 1, information warfare." She gestured towards Agnes from Neighborhood Watch, who sat bolt upright, a notepad and pen at the ready. "We will launch a public awareness campaign. We will draft a carefully worded, fact-based letter to be distributed to every single resident. It will outline the nature of Henderson's development, the scale, the industrial nature of the construction, the potential for noise, traffic, and, yes, Eleanor, the olfactory impact. We will frame this not as a complaint, but as a community alert. We will also draft letters to the editor of the Willow Creek Chronicle. We will make our concerns public, polite, and persistent." Next, she turned to Bob. "Phase 2, bureaucratic warfare. Mr. Henderson may not be subject to our bylaws, but he is subject to every single ordinance of this county. Bob, I want you to lead a task force. I want you to live at the county planning and zoning office. I want you to scrutinize every permit, every application, every environmental impact statement he has ever filed. Look for discrepancies, omissions, violations. Is his dust mitigation plan adequate? Are his construction vehicles following approved routes? Is his erosion control up to code? We will find a loose thread, and we will pull on it until his entire project unravels." Bob's eyes, magnified by his thick lenses, gleamed with an almost manic intensity. He nodded slowly, a small predatory smile forming on his lips. This was the kind of mission he was born for. Finally, Karen said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "Phase 3, the Panopticon Protocol." The dramatic name was her own invention, and she was rather proud of it. "Agnes, your neighborhood watch is about to get an upgrade. We will establish a dedicated, 24/7 Henderson hotline. I want every resident to be our eyes and ears. Every truck that arrives after hours, every suspicious noise, every pile of dirt that looks even slightly out of place, I want it documented. Time, date, license plate, photographic evidence if possible. We will create a database of his every move." "We are not harassing him," she added, looking directly at Harold. "We are merely exercising our due diligence as concerned citizens to ensure all activities in our community are safe and lawful." Harold, who had just finished his Danish, wiped his mouth nervously. "Karen, are you sure about this? This feels aggressive. What if he sues us? What if he retaliates?" Karen stopped pacing and fixed Harold with a look of pure, unadulterated steel. "Retaliate? Harold, he is the one who fired the first shot. He brought bulldozers to our doorstep. He is building a fortress that threatens our property values, our peace, and our very way of life. We are not aggressors. We are defenders. We are the thin, meticulously landscaped line between civilization and chaos. Are you with me?" A murmur of assent rippled through the room. Eleanor's fear had been replaced by righteous fury. Bob was already mentally outlining his review of municipal drainage codes. Agnes was designing a logo for the Henderson hotline. Karen had done it. She had transformed their fear and helplessness into a weapon. The war for Willow Creek Estates had officially begun. The following weeks were a blur of coordinated action. Karen's letter, a masterpiece of passive-aggressive prose, landed in every mailbox. It didn't explicitly call Henderson a villain, but it painted a vivid picture of a peaceful suburban dream. Being shattered by the roar of heavy machinery and the specter of incompatible land use, the Willow Creek Chronicle published 2 letters to the editor from concerned residents. Both ghostwritten by Karen in the same week, the Henderson hotline was an immediate, overwhelming success. Agnes's phone buzzed constantly. 7:14 a.m., a large, unmarked white van entered the Henderson property. Driver looked shifty. 2:32 policial militar, loud metallic banging, possibly in violation of the county noise ordinance for a Tuesday afternoon. 9:47 p.m., lights on in a construction trailer. What are they doing in there so late? Agnes meticulously logged every report in a color-coded spreadsheet, a monument to collective paranoia. Meanwhile, Bob became a fixture at the county records office, his obsessive nature finally unleashed for the greater good. He discovered that Henderson's permit for temporary power poles was set to expire a week earlier than the construction company's internal schedule seemed to account for. He found a minor zoning variance application for a retaining wall that hadn't been properly publicly noticed. They were small things, gnats in the face of a charging rhino, but they were something. Each discovery was a small victory, a validation of their cause. Karen orchestrated it all from her home office, a general commanding her troops from a pristine, clutter-free bunker. Yet, amidst the flurry of activity, a deeply unsettling fact began to emerge. It wasn't working. Henderson seemed completely immune to their campaign. The construction continued unabated. The walls of concrete barriers grew higher. The trenches grew deeper. He didn't respond to the newspaper articles. He didn't complain about the constant surveillance. In fact, he seemed to be enjoying it. One afternoon, Mrs. Higgins, perched on a stepladder to get a better photo of a suspicious-looking backhoe, reported that Henderson had spotted her, smiled, and given her a jaunty two-fingered salute from the brim of his Stetson. The lack of reaction was more unnerving than open hostility would have been. It spoke of a confidence, an unshakable certainty, that unnerved Karen to her core. He was playing with them. He's mocking us, she fumed to Harold over the phone after the saluting incident. He thinks this is a game. Well, Karen, maybe we should stop playing, Harold pleaded. The legal fund is already taking a hit from Mr. Peterson just being on retainer. But Karen refused. Quitting was not in her vocabulary. If the indirect approach wasn't working, she needed to find a way to hit him directly. She needed to disrupt his operations in a way he couldn't ignore. She went back to Bob's research. Tucked away in his notes was a section on traffic impact. County Ordinance 113.8 stipulated that any development projected to increase traffic on a residential thoroughfare by more than 15% required a formal traffic impact study and potential developer-funded mitigation measures, such as turn lanes or traffic signals. A light bulb went on in Karen's head. This was it. This was a direct, quantifiable, and expensive vulnerability. She quickly mobilized a new set of volunteers, armed with clickers and clipboards. A team of dedicated Willow Creek residents, mostly retirees with flexible schedules and a deep love for order, set up a discreet monitoring station at the entrance to the community. For 72 straight hours, they clicked and counted, logging every single vehicle, from Prius to Peterbilt. The data was beautiful. It was undeniable. The number of heavy trucks, concrete mixers, and flatbeds. Enter. The file arrived without fanfare, a simple digital transfer notification on her phone, yet Karen felt its weight as if it were a lead casket. She waited until her husband, Tom, was asleep, and the house had settled into its deep, suburban slumber. In the sterile quiet of her home office, illuminated only by the cool blue light of her monitor, she clicked the icon. The file, titled depot_sealed_BCB, unzipped into a series of scanned PDF documents. Pandora's box was open. The documents were transcripts of preliminary depositions, from the state's investigation into the sale of a massive tract of public land, known as the Black Creek Basin. For hours, Karen read her organic green smoothie forgotten on its coaster, a cold sweat beading on her brow. The dry, bureaucratic language of the transcripts painted a story of breathtaking corruption. The Black Creek Basin, a pristine wilderness area rich in timber and, more importantly, rare earth mineral deposits, had been sold for less than 5 cents on the dollar to a newly formed entity called Oro Verde Holdings, LLC. The deal had been rushed through the approval process with, as one deponent put it, unprecedented and inexplicable haste. The name that appeared again and again, the driving force behind the sale, was Land Commissioner Cole Henderson. The heart of the file, the document that made Karen's breath catch in her throat, was the deposition of a junior land assessor named Daniel Rourke. Rourke's testimony was different. It wasn't circumspect or evasive like the others. It was terrified. He described how his initial assessment of the basin's value was more than 20 times the final sale price. He detailed how he had flagged the Oro Verde bid as suspiciously undervalued, and how he had been summoned to a private meeting with Commissioner Henderson. He didn't shout, Rourke's testimony read. He was calm. He smiled. He put his hand on my shoulder and told me I was a bright young man with a promising career ahead of me. He said it would be a shame if a simple clerical error, a misplaced decimal point in my assessment, were to jeopardize that future. He talked about my student loans. He knew the name of the hospital my mother was in. It wasn't a threat. Not really. It was a statement of fact. He was just letting me know that he saw everything. Rourke had revised his assessment. The deal went through. A few months later, he resigned from his position, citing personal health reasons. The investigation, starved of a key witness and facing immense political pressure, eventually fizzled out. Oro Verde Holdings, LLC, after a series of labyrinthine transactions, was now defunct, its assets absorbed by other anonymous corporations. The money, and Henderson's connection to it, had vanished into the ether. Karen leaned back in her chair, the silence of the house pressing in on her. This was bigger than property values, bigger than barbed wire fences. This was grand larceny. On a statewide scale, Henderson wasn't just a bully. He was a master manipulator, a puppeteer who had stolen a fortune from the public trust and had gotten away with it, and now he lived next door. His fortress wasn't just for privacy, it was a monument to his impunity. Built with the spoils of his crime, she now held the one thing that could bring it all crashing down. But what could she do? She couldn't just leak it to the press. Henderson's lawyers from Blackwood, Thorne, and Associates would tear the unproven allegations to shreds and countersue her into oblivion for libel. The depositions were a map, but they weren't the treasure. She needed the key. She needed Daniel Rourke. The next morning, Karen scheduled an urgent, in-person meeting with Mr. Peterson, the HOA's lawyer, in the stale air of his strip mall office. Surrounded by dusty legal tomes, she laid out a printed copy of Rourke's deposition. As Mr. Peterson read, his already pale face turned the color of old parchment. "My God, Karen," he whispered, taking off his glasses and rubbing his eyes. This is dynamite, but it's also poison. These documents were sealed by a court. Possessing them is legally precarious, disseminating them is career suicide. For both of us, but it's the truth, Karen insisted. This man is a criminal, an alleged criminal who was never charged, Mr. Peterson corrected gently, and who has the best lawyer's money can buy. Karen, if you use this, they will not just sue you, they will dismantle your life. They will subpoena your emails, your phone records, your finances. They will depose your friends, your family. They will paint you as a vindictive, obsessive neighborhood tyrant engaged in a personal vendetta. This document, without the live, willing testimony of Daniel Rourke, is a suicide note. Karen's heart sank. So what do I do? My official legal advice, Mr. Peterson said, pushing the papers back across the desk as if they were radioactive, is to delete that file, burn these printouts, and forget you ever saw them. Focus on the county ordinances, the traffic, study, the drainage issues, fight him on solid, provable ground. But Karen knew that wasn't enough. Fighting over drainage felt like throwing pebbles at a tank. The only way to stop him was to expose him. And your unofficial advice, she asked. Mr. Peterson sighed, a long, weary sound. Find Daniel Rourke. Convince him to talk to the right people, the Attorney General, the FBI. Until then, you have nothing but a very, very dangerous secret. Karen left the office with a new, terrifying clarity. The war for Willow Creek Estates had moved into a new, clandestine phase. She was no longer an HOA president. She was an investigator. But Henderson, it seemed, had his own intelligence network. He must have sensed the shift in her strategy, the new glint of purpose in her eye, because the counterattack, when it came, was not aimed at her, but at the foundations of her support. It began with Bob. He called Karen in a panic, his voice a frantic squeak. Karen, it's the IRS. A full audit, business and personal. They're asking for receipts from 2018. Who keeps receipts from 2018? They said they received an anonymous tip about financial irregularities. I've never had an irregularity in my life. My checkbook is balanced to the penny. 2 days later, it was Agnes. She called in tears. Her husband's small, beloved bakery, a Willow Creek institution, had been subjected to a surprise multi-agency inspection. The health department, the fire marshal, and the state licensing board had descended simultaneously. They had found 3 minor, easily correctable violations, but had slapped him with a fine large enough to threaten his payroll and issued a temporary suspension of his license pending a follow-up. The anonymous tip, Bade said, cited grave concerns for public safety. The message was brutally clear. Henderson's reach extended far beyond the county planning department. He could pull levers of power she hadn't even known existed. He was a puppeteer, and he was now systematically cutting her strings. The final string snapped at an emergency board meeting Harold had called. He, Eleanor, and the 2 other remaining board members sat opposite Karen at the mahogany table in the Magnolia Room. Harold slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was his resignation. I'm sorry, Karen, he said, avoiding her eyes. I can't. My wife, she's terrified. We have kids, a mortgage. This isn't a fight about mailboxes anymore. This man, he plays a different game. We're out of our league. Eleanor and the others nodded in grim agreement, their own resignation letters placed neatly in front of them. We're sorry, Karen, but we're done. Karen sat in the empty room, the 4 letters arrayed before her like funeral wreaths. She was alone. The HOA was an army with no soldiers, a kingdom with no subjects. It was just her and the dangerous secret on her laptop. The final blow came 2 days later. In the one place Karen had always felt safe, the organic aisle of the local Whole Foods. She was contemplating the merits of kale versus chard when a low voice behind her said, I'd go with the chard, it's heartier, holds up better under pressure. She turned. It was Cole Henderson. He was dressed not in his usual dusty work clothes, but in a tailored linen shirt and expensive-looking slacks. He looked less like a rancher and more like the powerful man he was. He smiled, a polite, chillingly pleasant expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Peabody," he said, leaning on his shopping cart. "Fancy meeting you here." Karen's heart hammered against her ribs. Her instinct was to turn and walk away, but she was frozen in place. "Mr. Henderson, I just wanted to say, I hope there are no hard feelings about your board members," he said, his voice a soft, conversational purr. "It's a shame when people get involved in disputes that are really none of their business. It can have such unforeseen consequences. People get hurt. It's a messy world." He picked up a bunch of organic carrots, examining them thoughtfully. "You have a lovely family, Ms. Peabody. Tom's doing great things at his firm, I hear. And your daughter, Sarah, she's at Northwood Academy, isn't she? Wonderful school. My foundation is actually one of their biggest donors." The blood ran cold in her veins. This wasn't a veiled threat. It was a direct, surgical strike at the very center of her world. He was telling her, in the calmest, most civilized way possible, that he could reach out and touch every part of her life. Her husband's career, her daughter's education. "You've been very determined," he continued, placing the carrots in his cart. "I admire that. But determination needs to be tempered with pragmatism. A person has to know which fights they can win. You're a smart woman, Karen. I'm sure you'll make the smart choice." The 7-hour drive back from Osprey Point, Michigan, was a long, silent scream of defeat. The desolate pine forests of the north gave way to the flat, unremarkable farmlands of the Midwest, each mile taking Karen further from the terrified ghost in the cabin and closer to the monster in the fortress next door. Daniel Rourke's final words echoed in the sterile quiet of the rented Ford Focus. "He doesn't just ruin you, he erases you." For the first time since the bulldozers had first scarred the pristine asphalt of Magnolia Drive, Karen considered surrender. Real, unconditional surrender. She could delete the file, she could burn the printouts. She could sell. Her house had a loss, certainly, now that it was adjacent to a barbed wire compound, and move her family somewhere new, somewhere Henderson's shadow couldn't reach. She could retract her complaints, dissolve what was left of the HOA's opposition, and dedicate herself once more to the gentle tyranny of landscape violations and approved paint swatches. She could choose to be safe. She pulled into a soulless rest stop somewhere in Indiana, the air thick with the smell of diesel and regret. She bought a stale coffee and sat in her car, staring at the screen of her phone. The wallpaper was a photo of her family, taken last summer at the beach, her husband Tom, his arm around her, squinting happily into the sun. Her daughter Sarah Mitloff, her face a perfect portrait of teenage joy. He knew the name of the hospital. "My mother was in dot. My foundation is one of their biggest donors." Henderson had already brought the war to them. He had mentioned Tom's firm. He had laid a veiled claim to Sarah's school. He had demonstrated with chilling precision that there was nowhere she could run where his influence couldn't find her. Surrender wouldn't guarantee safety. It would be an invitation for him to press his advantage, to ensure her silence was permanent. Rourke's terror wasn't a warning to retreat. It was proof that retreat was impossible. Henderson didn't leave loose ends. A cold resolve, as hard and clear as a diamond, formed in the pit of her stomach. She wasn't fighting for property values anymore. She wasn't even fighting for justice for the people of her state. She was fighting for her family. She was a mother protecting her cub from a predator, and she would not back down. She finished the bitter coffee, dropped the cup in the trash, and got back on the road. Her strategy had failed, so she needed a new one. If she couldn't use the witness, she would have to follow the money. Her first call upon returning to the manicured prison of Willow Creek Estates was not to her lawyer, but to the young reporter from the Chronicle, Ben Carter. She requested a meeting, specifying a time and a place she was certain Henderson's network wouldn't monitor. A noisy, crowded food court in a mall 2 towns over. Ben was younger than she expected, with an unruly thatch of dark hair and the kind of restless energy that seemed to power the entire mall. He listened intently as Karen, speaking in a low, urgent voice, laid out the entire story of the depositions, the threats, her trip to Michigan, and Rourke's terror. She omitted nothing. "He's got you in a classic slapsuit bind," Ben said, taking a nervous sip of his oversized soda. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. He's using his high-priced lawyers to bury you in legal fees and scare you into silence. My editor won't touch this story with a 10-foot pole for the same reason. Henderson's firm sent a letter of concern to our publisher last year over a completely unrelated zoning story. The message was clear. Investigate us at your peril. So you can't help me?" Karen asked, her hopes plummeting. "I didn't say that," Ben said, a sly grin spreading across his face. "I said my editor won't touch it, officially, but a story like this is a career maker, a Pulitzer. I can't use the paper's resources, but I have my own time, and I have access to databases that you don't." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "If you're serious about this, Karen, I'm in. Off the books. Deep background. We find something solid, something undeniable that they can't sue their way out of, and we'll have a story that no one can kill." An alliance was formed over a shared plate of greasy Sporo pizza. Karen, the meticulous rule-following queen of suburbia, and Ben, the cynical, rule-bending journalist. They were a strange pair, but they were united by a common enemy. When Karen returned to Willow Creek, she found that Henderson had made his next move. Two sleek, black SUVs were parked on the street near her house. They were unmarked, but the men inside were not. They wore black polo shirts with a small silver logo on the breast, a stylized Greek shield. One of them, a thick-necked man with mirrored sunglasses, met Karen's gaze as she pulled into her driveway. He didn't smile, he didn't frown, he just watched. A new sign had been professionally installed at the entrance to Willow Creek Estates, this community patrolled by Aegis Security Solutions. Henderson hadn't just hired guards for his own property. He had extended his security perimeter to the entire neighborhood. It was a masterful, insidious move. On the surface, it was a generous contribution to community safety. But in reality, it was a constant, visible occupation. It was a message to Karen that she was being watched, and a message to her neighbors that her actions had consequences for them all. The call started that evening. Karen, it's Cynthia from down the street. I have to say, these security patrols are a bit much. My son was riding his bike and one of them followed him home. It's making everyone nervous. Karen, it's George from Lot 22. Listen, a few of us have been talking. Maybe it's time to just let this Henderson thing go. We don't want this kind of trouble in the neighborhood. You're stirring the pot, and now we all have to deal with these stormtroopers. Henderson was turning her own community against her, using her neighbors' fear to further isolate her. The black SUVs became a permanent fixture, a silent, menacing audience to her life. Undeterred, Karen and Ben began their work. They met in secret, sometimes at the library, sometimes in Ben's disastrously messy apartment, which smelled of old coffee and ambition. Their goal was to trace the life and death of Oro Verde Holdings, LLC. Ben, with his access to LexisNexis and other professional databases, did the heavy lifting. Karen, with her obsessive organizational skills, cross-referenced every name, every address, creating complex diagrams on a large whiteboard she'd bought for the purpose. The trail was a masterclass in corporate obfuscation. Oro Verde had been incorporated in Delaware, the land of anonymous LLCs. Its mailing address was a P.O. box in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a state famous for its corporate privacy laws. From there, the ownership was layered through a series of shell companies, with meaningless names: Atme Investments, Summit Group, Apex Global, with registered addresses in the Cayman Islands and Panama. This is professional-grade money laundering, Ben muttered one night, scrolling through pages of corporate filings. This isn't just one guy hiding some cash. This is a system. It's designed to be untraceable. They were hitting a wall. The money vanished into the offshore fog, and there seemed to be no way to follow it. For days, they searched for a crack, a mistake, a single name that connected the phantom companies back to the real world. The breakthrough came from the oldest document they had, the original incorporation filing for Oro Verde Holdings in Delaware. Unlike the subsequent offshore companies, the initial filing required the signature of a registered agent. The signature itself was an illegible scrawl, but the printed name beneath it was clear, Marcus Thorne-esque. Okay, so we have a name, Karen said, writing it in red marker on her whiteboard. A lawyer. He's probably just a hired gun, paid to sign a name and ask no questions. Maybe, Ben said, typing the name into a search engine. Let's see what Mr. Thorne is up to these days. The search results were immediate. Marcus Thorne was not some low-level paper pusher. He was a high flyer, a top corporate lawyer in the state capital. There were press releases announcing his major deals, photos of him at glittering charity galas, and articles praising his legal acumen. This guy is big time, Ben said, clicking through the images. Specializes in mergers, acquisitions, and complex corporate structuring. That's a fancy way of saying he helps rich guys hide their money. Karen felt a prickle of unease. The name seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it. Which firm is he with? Shay asked, leaning closer to the screen. Ben clicked on a link. The web page that loaded was sleek, professional, and chillingly familiar. It was a deep charcoal gray, with stark white lettering. At the top, a prestigious, powerful name, Blackwood. Thorne and Associates. Karen stared at the screen, her blood turning to ice. Thorne? It was there, right there on the letterhead of the cease and desist that was sitting on her desk at home. Marcus Thorne. He wasn't just a random lawyer Henderson had hired. He was a named partner at the very firm that was threatening to destroy her. Ben saw it too. He went pale. No way, he whispered. No way. He frantically clicked on the Our Team page. A gallery of professionally photographed lawyers in expensive suits appeared, and there he was. Marcus Thorne, older now than in the old filing, with silvering temples and a confident, predatory smile. His bio boasted of his expertise in creating tax-efficient offshore entities for a discerning clientele. It all clicked into place with a sickening, horrifying clarity. This wasn't a case of a powerful man hiring a powerful law firm. The law firm was the conspiracy. Thorne hadn't. The discovery that Marcus Thorne was a named partner at Henderson's law firm didn't just change the game. It burned the stadium to the ground. Karen and Ben sat in the greasy glow of his apartment, the triumphant energy of their investigation replaced by the cold, heavy silence of dread. Every victory Karen had clawed for, every small step forward, now felt like a carefully choreographed move in a game where she had never even known the rules. She wasn't just poking a bear, she was trying to rob the bear's entire family, who also happened to write the forest's laws. "They've been playing us from the start," Ben whispered, running a hand through his already chaotic hair. The cease and desist letter, it wasn't just a threat, it was reconnaissance. Thorne was using the legal process to gauge how much you knew. He was the architect of the whole thing, Karen murmured, the words tasting like ash. Oro Verde the shell companies, and Henderson was his client. Or his partner, which means Blackwood, Thorne, and Associates, isn't just defending a past crime, Ben concluded, his eyes wide. They are actively engaged in a present-day criminal conspiracy to conceal it, and we, my dear Ms. Peabody, are now a direct threat to that enterprise. Paranoia, once a creeping suspicion, became their operating procedure. They wiped their laptops, factory reset their phones, and bought cheap cash-only burner phones from a corner store. Their meetings moved from public spaces to the anonymous bubble of Karen's minivan. Driving aimless routes through neighboring towns, conversation punctuated by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. They communicated in whispers, convinced that every lamppost, every parked car, could be hiding a listening device. The ever-present black SUVs of Aegis Security Solutions no longer felt like intimidation. They felt like an escort, patiently, waiting to deliver them to their doom. The strain began to show at home. The crusade that had started with righteous indignation over suburban aesthetics had metastasized into something dark and all-consuming. Tom, her husband, confronted her. One evening in the kitchen, he held up a notice from their daughter's school about a generous new grant from the Henderson Family Foundation to upgrade the science labs. "I saw another one of those black cars parked down the street today, Karen," he said, his voice tight with a fear he was trying to suppress. "They just sat there for an hour, watching the house. Sarah's school is taking his money? What is this? What have you gotten us into?" "He's a criminal, Tom," Karen insisted, her voice raw. "He stole millions from the state. I can prove it." "Can you?" Tom shot back, his composure finally cracking. "Or can you just get yourself sued into bankruptcy? Or worse, this man threatened you, Karen. He threatened our family, and your response is to double down, to meet with strange reporters and drive around in the dark. This has to stop, before he stops it for you." Karen had no comforting answer. The fear in her husband's eyes was a mirror of her own, the weight of her choices pressed down on her, the knowledge that her fight for justice could very well shatter the life she was supposedly protecting. But to stop now, to show weakness, felt even more dangerous. She was in too deep to swim back to shore. Her paranoia paid off a few days later. Driven by a gnawing suspicion, she bought a cheap electronics hobby kit online that included a basic RF signal detector. After Tom and Sarah had left for the day, she swept her home office. The device was silent until she passed it over the baseboard, near the outlet under her desk. It let out a high-pitched squeal, her heart pounding. She unscrewed the outlet cover. There, nestled behind the wiring, was a tiny professional-grade listening device, no bigger than a thumbnail. It had its own power source and a tiny SIM card. It was active. She stared at it, a wave of violation so profound it made her physically sick. They had been in her house, in her sanctuary. Henderson had been listening to everything. Her panicked calls to Harold, her strategy sessions with the HOA board, her tearful conversation with Mr. Peterson, her initial, triumphant call to Ben. He had heard it all. He had always been 10 steps ahead because he was listening to the playbook as she wrote it, carefully. She removed the bug, wrapped it in foil, and placed it in a coffee can. She didn't crush it. It was evidence. But it was also a declaration of war. From now on, her house was a stage. She would act the part of a defeated, terrified woman for the audience she knew was listening. But the real work would be done elsewhere. In the back of her moving minivan, communicating with Ben via handwritten notes on a legal pad, a new plan formed, born of desperation and cold fury. Henderson was untouchable. Thorne was his legal fortress. But what about the first name on the letterhead? Blackwood. Alistair Blackwood. Ben's research painted a picture of the firm's patriarch. He was in his late 70s, a lion in winter. He had founded the firm 50 years ago on principles of corporate law and civic duty. He was old school, from an era before lawyers became indistinguishable from hedge fund managers. He rarely appeared in court anymore, serving more as a figurehead, a symbol of the firm's prestige. "He's the key," Karen wrote, underlining the name. "Thorne is the snake, but Blackwood is the garden. Does he know what's been allowed to grow in it?" "It's a long shot," Ben scribbled back. "These guys stick together. But if he's truly old guard, he might have a sense of honor, or at least a sense of self-preservation. A scandal of this magnitude could destroy the firm's reputation, everything he built." Their new mission was clear. They couldn't expose the entire conspiracy at once. They needed to give Blackwood a piece of the puzzle so damning, so undeniable, that he would be forced to look at the rest. They needed leverage. Ben found it. Buried in court archives, he uncovered a separate, seemingly unrelated bankruptcy case from a few years prior. A mid-sized manufacturing company had gone under, and the proceedings had been unusually nasty, with accusations of fraud. The CEO had been represented by Marcus Thorne. Ben, cross-referencing shipping manifests and financial statements, found a thread. Thorne had used a nearly identical web of offshore shell companies registered at the same addresses as the Oro Verde network to siphon assets out of the company before declaring bankruptcy, leaving the employees and creditors with nothing. Was a smaller crime, but it was self-contained, and with the documents Ben had found provable. It was the perfect test. If they could present Alistair Blackwood with concrete evidence that his star partner was a common fraudster, how would he react? Would he close ranks to protect the firm, or would he cut out the cancer to save the patient? Getting to Alistair Blackwood was like trying to get an audience with the Pope. His schedule was managed by a series of secretaries and assistants, whose sole purpose was to say no. Karen tried calling, emailing, sending registered letters. She was stonewalled at every turn. She realized she had to use Henderson's own tactics against him. She had to bypass the system. She researched Blackwood's habits. She learned he was a creature of routine. Every Thursday afternoon, he lunched at the Citadel Club, an exclusive old money establishment downtown. The following Thursday, Karen put on her most expensive suit, the one she wore to the most important HOA functions. She walked into the opulent, wood-paneled lobby of the Citadel Club as if she owned the place. When the concierge moved to stop her, she simply said, "I'm here to see Mr. Blackwood. He's expecting me." Her tone, a perfect blend of authority and entitlement, honed by years of chairing contentious community meetings, brooked no argument. The concierge hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Karen swept past him. She found Blackwood in a quiet corner of the dining room, sitting alone at a table overlooking a small, manicured garden. He was exactly as she'd pictured him, tall and thin, with a mane of white hair and a face etched with the kind of gravitas that only comes from decades of power. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steady, despite the frantic beating of her heart. He looked up, his pale blue eyes sharp and intelligent. He showed no surprise, only a mild, regal curiosity. "I don't believe we've been introduced. My name is Karen Peabody. You're a difficult man to get a meeting with." She placed a thin portfolio on the table. "But I believe you'll want to see this." He looked at the portfolio, then back at her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of ages, he gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit down, Ms. Peabody." Karen sat, her back ramrod straight. She laid out the case against Thorne, speaking calmly and concisely, presenting the evidence of the bankruptcy fraud, the web of shell companies, the irrefutable paper trail. She didn't mention Henderson. She didn't mention the Black Creek Basin. She was testing him, presenting him with the single, rotten apple, waiting to see if he would acknowledge the rot in the entire barrel. Blackwood listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the documents she spread before him. His expression was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic calm. When she was finished, he carefully squared the papers into a neat pile. He looked out at the garden for a long time. Karen held her breath, the entire future of her fight hanging in the balance. Finally, he turned back to her. His eyes held not the shock or outrage she had hoped for, but something else entirely, a profound, almost paternal weariness. It was the look of a man who was not surprised, but merely disappointed that it had come. The click of the lock was a sound of absolute finality. Karen was sealed inside the hushed wood-paneled sanctum of the Citadel Club with Alistair Blackwood, a man who she now understood was not just a lawyer, but a king in a bespoke suit, and she had just committed treason in his court. The air, thick with the scent of old leather and expensive cigars, suddenly felt thin and hard to breathe. Blackwood watched her, his pale eyes holding a clinical, almost bored, detachment. He had seen 100 desperate gambits in his lifetime. Hers, it seemed, was just another Tuesday. The wait for Henderson was an exercise in psychological torture. Blackwood said nothing. He simply sipped his water, a sliver of lemon floating placidly on the surface. He was a statue of corrupt power, radiating an aura of such profound confidence that it seemed to suck the very hope from the room. Karen's mind raced, cycling through her options. Her phone had no signal. The windows were thick, likely bulletproof, and overlooked a private, walled garden. There was no escape. She had walked into the heart of the machine, and the machine was about to grind her to dust. When the door finally opened, it was not a club attendant but Henderson who entered, closing and locking it behind him. He was dressed in the same expensive casual attire as before, but the folksy rancher persona was gone. What stood before her was the man Daniel Rourke had described, calm, smiling, and utterly terrifying. Cole Henderson, the disgraced land commissioner, looked perfectly at home beside Alistair Blackwood, the architect of his power. "Karen," Henderson said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "I have to admit, I'm impressed. Tracking down Rourke, finding Thorne's signature, you have a talent for this. It's a shame to see it so misguided." He sat down, joining Blackwood at the table, forming a tribunal of two. They were the board of directors of her demise. "Let's be clear about the situation. Ms. Peabody, Blackwood began, his voice a low rumble. So there are no further misunderstandings. You have uncovered certain business dealings from the past, unsavory, perhaps, from a layman's perspective, but you have no context. You have no proof of anything that would stand up in a court of law against the resources of this firm. Your witness is a broken man who will deny he ever spoke to you. Your documents are sealed, making them inadmissible, and your possession of them illegal. What you have, Henderson added, leaning forward, is a great deal of trouble. You have interfered with our business, you have harassed our associates, you have, to put it plainly, made a colossal nuisance of yourself, and we are long past the point of sending cease and desist letters. He smiled, but it was a smile devoid of all warmth. Here is the offer. It's the only one you will receive. You will cease all of your investigations. You will destroy every document you have collected. You will convince your reporter friend to do the same. You will go back to your life in Willow Creek and concern yourself only with the height of your neighbor's hedges. In return, the Aegis patrols will vanish. The legal actions will be dropped. The anonymous tips to government agencies will cease. Your husband's career will continue to flourish. Your daughter will continue to enjoy her time at Northwood Academy. We will leave you and your family in peace. You will be erased from our concerns. And if I refuse? Karen asked, her voice surprisingly steady. Henderson's smile widened. Then we will be forced to erase you in a more literal sense. Not violently. Ms. Peabody, we're not thugs. We are, as Alistair said, a great deal more creative than that. We will use the system. A tragic car accident caused by a faulty part in your vehicle. A sudden, aggressive audit from a federal agency that discovers fabricated evidence of tax fraud. A terrible misunderstanding that leads to your husband being implicated in a scandal at his firm. We will dismantle your life, piece by piece, until the name Karen Peabody is nothing but a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. We will do it legally. We will do it quietly, and no one will be able to help you. They had laid it all out. The sheer, overwhelming scale of their power. They weren't just offering her a deal. They were explaining the fundamental laws of the universe she now inhabited. They were the gravity, and she was a feather. Karen took a slow, deliberate sip of her water. She placed the glass down with a soft click. She looked from Henderson's predatory smile to Blackwood's reptilian calm. That's a very comprehensive offer, she said, her tone conversational. It seems you've thought of everything. Well, almost everything. She glanced at her watch. You're right about the bug you planted in my office. It was very professional. It allowed you to stay ahead of me for weeks. But it also taught me a valuable lesson. If you think your enemy is listening, you'd better be putting on a good show. A flicker of confusion crossed Henderson's face. Blackwood's expression remained unchanged. When I found your device, Karen continued, I didn't destroy it. I left it right where it was, and for the past week, I've been talking to it. I've talked about how scared I was, how I was going to give up, how my last, desperate, foolish move was to try and confront Mr. Blackwood alone. I performed the role of a cornered, desperate woman for you, and you believed it. Because it's what you expect from someone like me. She leaned forward, and for the first time, a smile touched her own lips. It was not a pleasant smile. It was sharp and dangerous. You see, you thought you were trapping me. But I knew you'd do this. I counted on it. I needed to get you both in a room together where you would feel safe enough to admit to your partnership, which you have. So, thank you for that. What is this nonsense? Henderson snapped, his composure finally cracking. It's called a dead man's switch, Karen said calmly. Before I came here, my friend Ben Carter prepared a package. It contains everything, the sealed depositions, the evidence of Thorne's fraud, a sworn, notarized affidavit from me detailing your threats, the bug, the Aegis patrols, everything. It also contains a copy of a recording. What recording? Blackwood asked, his voice losing its bored edge. The one I'm making right now, Karen said, tapping a small disguised brooch on her lapel. This whole conversation, your threats, your admissions, it's all being streamed live to a secure server. The package I mentioned is linked to that stream. If the stream is interrupted, or if Ben doesn't receive a safe code from me and she checked her watch again, the next 10 minutes, the package is automatically distributed to a list of over 100 recipients. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Justice Department, the SEC, every major news outlet and federal prosecutor we could think of. Your trap, gentlemen, is my trigger. By bringing me here, you've armed the bomb. The silence in the room was absolute. The color drained from Henderson's face. He stared at Karen, his mouth slightly agape, the confident predator suddenly realizing he was the one in the cage. Blackwood's mask of aristocratic calm finally shattered, replaced by a look of pure, cold fury. He had built an empire on controlling every variable, and this suburban housewife had just introduced one he had never conceived of. You're bluffing? Henderson hissed, but there was no conviction in his voice. Am I? Karen asked. The land commissioner who defrauded the state and the name partner of the most powerful law firm in the capital, threatening a private citizen in a locked room. It's a hell of a story. I imagine it will lead the evening news for weeks. The stock of this firm, Mr. Blackwood, will cease to exist by morning. You won't be erased, you'll be infamous. She was in control. She let the reality of their new situation sink in, the beautiful, intricate trap of their own making closing around them. Now she said, her voice dropping the pleasantries, imbued with the steel she had forged over the past few months. Here's my offer. It's the only one you will receive. She laid out her terms, not as a request, but as a decree. First, the property at Willow Creek. You will not build your fortress. You will tear down the walls you have built. You will then sell the entire parcel, at fair market value, to the State Conservation Trust, to be preserved as a public park in perpetuity. Second, the Black Creek Basin. I don't care how you do it. I don't care which levers you have to pull or who you have to bribe. You will unwind the sale. You will see that land returned to the people of this state. Third, you will provide complete and binding assurance for the safety and immunity of myself, my family, Ben Carter, and Daniel Rourke, and his family. The lawsuit is dropped. The security patrols vanish. Your entire network will forget we exist. In return, she concluded, the evidence Ben has collected will be placed in a secure, sealed vault. It will remain there, unreleased, as long as you comply with every single term. But if any harm comes to any of us, if you deviate from this agreement in any way, the switch will be flipped. Think of it as a life insurance policy, with me as the beneficiary. For a long moment, the two most powerful men she had ever met simply stared at her, their faces a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. They were beaten, not by a prosecutor, not by a rival, but by an HOA president who was simply too stubborn to be erased. Alistair Blackwood, his voice a rasp, finally spoke. You have our word. Months later, life in Willow Creek Estates had returned to an uncanny normalcy. The black SUVs were gone. The ominous walls bordering Lot 14B were gone, replaced by the gentle hum of bulldozers restoring the land to its natural